Welcome, everyone, to a new Record Club episode of the Jams and Tea podcast, where we pick a record for all of us to review each week, except this week it's a little different. I mean, we're still doing that, but this particular episode is, I feel like calling it special is a bit too positively imbuing the situation, but
we were gonna talk about Evanescence's Fallen this week. That was
Mhm.
what we announced in our last episode, but unfortunately something has happened since then which has changed the circumstance, and I'll let Jake talk about that.
Yeah, that video is still coming out just a little bit later, but we felt it best that we do this as immediately as possible, just because I think that this isn't the express reason, but I know my personal sort of real affinity for wanting to do this and pushing for it was because the band, the Foo Fighters, a band that I think all of us really like to different degrees. If you pay attention to the news, you will no doubt be aware of the fact that the longtime drummer of the band, Taylor Hawkins, recently passed away at the criminally young age of 50. And I mean, it really got us in our feelings because that band is really close to a lot of us. And unfortunately, we've only really reviewed their most recent project, which is not really a favorable project to talk about when it comes to a band that is so beloved by us. So we wanted to take the first opportunity we could to talk about not only this band in a better context, but an album and a piece of work that we think is, of course, great, but also underappreciated. So we can finally kind of settle it and give it its due, just because Foo Fighters, obviously you don't really need me to tell you who they are, but they kind of came out with an initial run of records that, the self-titled and Color and the Shape, which are considered modern rock classics. But after that, I don't really think there's a consensus etched into stone about a lot of these albums, other than the minorly underwhelming ones. But the album we're talking about today, There's Nothing Left to Lose, is an album that I think all of us would consider to be in line with the quality and output of early Foo Fighters that just doesn't get the same amount of love that the Color and the Shape or the self-titled do.
And I mean, it's also worth mentioning as well, we debated which album to talk about today to honor Taylor. And the other choice, which maybe seems like the equally obvious choice, Wasting Light, which I think is the album where his drumming is at its most technically impressive. But this album, I think, made sense to settle on because, as you say, Jake, despite coming from their prime era, it's kind of underrated. And also, I think it is also the first album of the Foos that Taylor plays on. So it kind of represents a new start for the band in certain ways. It represents kind of the beginning of the story. Taylor had, of course, been prolific as a sideman or a gun for hire in a number of bands prior to this. He played on Alanis Morissette's Jagged Little Pill tour. Like, he played the drums on that entire tour, and that kind of achieved a lot of publicity and renown as a drummer from that. And actually, what's interesting, the story is that after recording Color and the Shape, Dave contacted Taylor for his opinion on who the next drummer in the Foo Fighters should be, and then ended up being that Taylor himself was the best fit. And the drumming on this record is great, don't get me wrong, but I think it may not be the most technically astounding work of Taylor's career, but I think it makes sense to commemorate as the beginning of a legacy that would cement him as one of the greatest rock drummers, not even of his generation, but of any generation. And as is often said, the standout drummer in a band that includes Dave Grohl. And it is often said, and it's true. I mean, they are both S-tier caliber drummers, and Taylor's life and work, we can only begin to celebrate it by discussing this record. And as Jake says as well, it's not just that, it's the fact that the Foos are such an important band to us, and we haven't talked about any of their classics. And so I think a lot of words have already been spilled on albums like Foo Fighters, the self-titled, and Color and the Shape. So this, I think, is a beautiful one to commemorate. And Morgan, I mean, the Foo Fighters are in your DNA. What's
the resident Foo Fighter?
What's your relationship with the band, and I guess specifically moving into this album and how it's kind of been in your life and what it means to you?
So basically, in my musical journey, that like when I began listening to music in a pretty serious way, that was about seventh grade. The first band I loved was Green Day, and then my mom saw that I was asking to buy their albums on iTunes and stuff, and once my mom noticed that, she started playing more of the Foo Fighters' greatest hits in the car, which, for the record, is maybe the only greatest hits album that I still listen to. Like, it's sequenced really well, and every song on it is like flawless. So like, it's just like it's the perfect I want to throw something on album. They were basically like the second or third band that I ever loved in a serious way. And then, Nirvana followed after that and the whole grunge wave. And I sort of, it took me a while to really listen to albums in a super intent way. And I think I got around to There Is Nothing Left to Lose in full, having heard a lot of the songs off of it. But yeah, once I got around to it in full when I was about 17 or 18, it's both a really interesting sort of left turn for the band after Color in the Shape, and simultaneously exactly what you want and expect from a band who is basically making the big follow-up to their, I mean, it's basically their sophomore effort, really, as a unit, because the self-titled album is definitely a Foo Fighters album, but it also was just Dave Grohl by himself. And this really does feel like a sophomore effort from a band who is still on the rise and will be on the rise for a while.
Well, they're kind of like a band that were constructing themselves in real time across those first three records. Yep. So while Color in the Shape is like a very fully realized record, you could even make an argument that this is really like the beginning of the Foo Fighters as we know them because of Taylor's addition here.
Yeah, and it is in particular that they finally settle on Taylor Hawkins as the mainstay drummer for this act, and the person who second only to Dave Grohl himself is really the secondary creative force behind this band. People are always eager to celebrate the man's drumming because he's just super proficient and always on point, like every single song pretty much. But I think what's kind of left in the background is just how integral he is to the bones of Foo Fighters, because it's easy to sort of feel like Foo Fighters is just the Dave Grohl show. And Hawkins himself was often just like, I do what Dave wants out of this project. I am a vessel for it, and we sort of, once we can agree on what's good and what we want to do for the next thing, I kind of just let him captain the ship.
I was going to say, you had I think Pat Smear was helping out on those first two records as well, and he's obviously quite an influential and very creatively driven individual, and would join the band properly from Wasting Light onward. But really at that time, on this record specifically, you're right, you do have these, obviously Dave front and center as the main creative voice, and obviously Nate Mendel's bass playing is important to the band and always has been as well. But you're right that Taylor is definitely the secondary creative force here in these songs. And one little detail I want to add in just briefly is that it's unclear, and it's kind of been alluded to, that Dave is doing some of the drumming on this album, and then Taylor is doing the rest of it. But very purposefully, though Dave has a percussion credit, Taylor's the only one credited as playing drums. They both have percussion credits, but Taylor's the only one credited with playing drums. And they've deliberately been very avoidant of even confirming which songs each person is on in the actual recordings on the album. And I think it's meaningful that even with that information, you can really, maybe some super fans who are like super into like the specific drumming styles of these two men could tell, but I don't think you can tell any difference discernibly in the drumming performances across these songs. They are universally fantastic and they feel very unified. And I think deliberately, despite the fact that Taylor was still easing into the band at this point and Dave was maybe helping out a little bit, they very much wanted the percussion of this record to have Taylor's voice shining through and to be attributed to Taylor. And so that's just a little niggle that I wanted to acknowledge that some fans might have brought up. But it speaks to how unified Foo Fighters were as a band, even though they were still kind of forming and coming together and going up through these lineup changes. At this point, Dave, Nate, and Taylor were rock solid here and onward.
I think the cool thing about Foo Fighters is that as a presence in like music and in terms of genre, is that I can fit them under lots of umbrella terms and like genres, and you can call them post-grunge or alt-rock or anything, but there's never anything I've been able to comfortably call them other than just kind of a rock band. Like even sound-wise, for like one of the producers on this album, for instance, was a guy they'd worked with before because he helped produce In Utero, but you know, the dude also worked on Versus by Pearl Jam, Super Unknown by Soundgarden, Vitalogy, Down on the Upside, Weezer's Pinkerton. But I think the cool thing about Foo Fighters is that they're one of the most enduring rock bands who have stayed a rock band the entirety of their career. They haven't like made any huge genre diversions. They have just stayed, and they've been met with immense success because of it. And to me, that makes them like a huge standout, just because they never like kowtowed to the whims of the market or anything other than like the passion for what they were doing. It was just whatever the bandmates wanted to do, and it just resulted in a really pure distilled form of rock music.
Yeah, I think there's like these two distinct pathways forward for grunge bands from the mid-90s. And I want to use two bands as an example here, even though they're slightly displaced in terms of when they started and when they hit their peak of relevancy. But I think you can see, not exclusively two paths, but like for a successful, beloved grunge band that continues their successful, beloved legacy, you either have the Pearl Jam path or you have the Foo Fighters path. And the Pearl Jam path is you shun, or not shun necessarily, but you just kind of stop caring about the notion of commercial appeal and crossover. And you kind of just follow your weirdest instincts and you go down this path that sees you kind of almost becoming a cult band, except that you're a cult band that had a massive, huge, dominating success in the 90s. And the Foo Fighters path is different because you start, and of course, you know, there's external factors here, like, the legacy of Nirvana hanging over it and all that sort of thing. You start in this more modest place and you gradually accumulate this commercial appeal and success as you go onwards, and you embrace that and you lean into that. And I think that because of the way that music is discussed and because of the extent to which critical discourses and blogs and etc. have all kind of like infiltrated the way that we think about and evaluate bands and music and stuff, Foo Fighters and bands like them can get like comparatively a bit of a bad rap, or, you know, maybe a comparatively good rap compared to Pearl Jam, depending on who you're asking and depending on what kind of voices you're looking towards. But from the real sort of like what we think of as the most discerning critical voices, you can get a bit of Foo Fighters being regarded, I would say, in a slightly narrower lens as kind of maybe even not given their full due as a creative force. And that's something that I bought into for the longest time before I really dug into their records. And viewers of the podcast may remember that at the start of last year, in the run up to when we reviewed Medicine at Midnight, I made a point of listening to every Foo Fighters album. And that was one of the most memorable weeks of that entire year for me. I still remember all those records clearly. And the biggest takeaway I remember is how much more I enjoyed the majority of them than I expected to. And I think that speaks to the extent to which, while Foo Fighters are definitely not underrated in terms of like their popularity and in terms of how successful a band they've been, I think maybe to some extent, some of their music and the technical proficiency and the artistry in Foo Fighters is underappreciated, because there's this assumption that rock music that leaned into this kind of creative mass appeal lens is in some way kind of rejecting artistry. or is in some way kind of like not necessarily rejecting, but just losing interest in artistry and moving towards this direction. And there's a lot of things that influence that discourse and that kind of perception of music. But my point with this long-winded anecdote is that the difference here, the thing that connects the Foo Fighters between these two worlds of like artistic rock music that you might associate with a band like Pearl Jam in this era and commercial music, is Taylor Hawkins, his physicality, his creativity, and what he does on the kit is, and this is not to say that Grohl doesn't do it as well, but Hawkins is the man here. And his playing elevates the music and gives additional textures and muscle to the music that complements Dave's incredible guitar work, of course, but actually adds this additional layer that I think makes Foo Fighters a more musically complex band than they're sometimes given credit for. And while I think this is best displayed on some of their like mid 2000s, early 2010s records, there's no denying that you can feel it here. And it's super strong, and it gives the music an incredible sense of muscle, even though I would say that this is an album where the guitar is probably and the melodic focus is probably the most dominant thing. It would still be substantially less if it weren't for that muscle that's given behind the kit. And I think Dave is able to bring that guitar front and center and able to write these really heavily melodic and riff-driven songs on this record because he's able to let Taylor take the kit and have that as his domain. And so as a result of that, you get a record which I think is honestly a bit better rounded for me than Color and the Shape. As good a record as Color and the Shape undeniably is, I actually like this album better. I think this album has, while there are some songs in the back half that I don't enjoy as much as songs in the first half, I still feel this album is a better rounded musical experience and has, you know, I mean, Color and the Shape will always have, you know, songs like Everlong, etc. But for me, this is an album that never really loses that spark the entire way through and has this additional heft to it that I think Color and the Shape doesn't quite have the whole way through to the same extent. And we're talking fine margins here, but it's just my perception. I think there's a little more refinement here that I really, really love. And I will say, though the last sort of 4 or so songs in the album aren't quite at the level of the earlier stuff on the record, they have grown on me. And I think they are in large part, and I'll get into this a little bit later when we start talking about songs, in large part, they're elevated by what Taylor is adding rhythmically. There's a real sense of urgency in that rhythmicality. Even when you're having songs like Ain't It the Life, which are like more pared back musically, you still, I think, have a presence from him, and he's always serving the song in a way that makes him stand out, I think. And that's something that I think maybe people overlook when they think about this record, but really reveals itself to you when you zero in on it, and especially some of the amazing deep cuts on this thing.
To circle back a little bit, it feels to me like the goal of this record going into it was that Dave could focus in on these really riff-driven, guitar-heavy songs because he now had someone that was basically him as a drummer on the kit back there. So he just didn't have to worry about that. And I think really the remarkable thing about it is, as someone who has listened to these songs a lot, I think there is a clear difference between the drumming on even Color and the Shape and drumming here. Like the drum track to Everlong, which Taylor Hawkins has only elevated every single time they've played it since then, is definitely a Dave Grohl drum track. I could hear it in every single fill. But to me, I think the chorus of Generator in particular is a great example of something that just sounds like Taylor Hawkins to me. The way that he uses the ride cymbal with the toms in the chorus gives that chorus this real sense of almost primal urgency, when I think most drummers would have, just done the hi-hat and, kick pedal and snare thing that the chorus does do, once it repeats a couple times, particularly towards the end of the song as it builds up to its climax. But like that chorus to me, particularly the drumming of it, feels so Taylor Hawkins to me, and I like you can see it even more because there are so many parts like it on something like Wasting Light. It makes me think a lot of the chorus to Rope off of that album. The thing about Hawkins is that like nobody really made drumming look easier and more fun than him. Like some of the shit that he pulls off in these songs is almost easy to write off because he was so good at it that he made it look and sound like it was just what he did. But the amount of personality that he implemented into each of the songs that he recorded from this album onwards is defining for the Foo Fighters. The band is fundamentally different without him.
One of the things that has been most commonly said about Taylor since his passing, and people have talked about his temperament and his personality and what a warm and sort of selfless person he is. And I think that you can feel and understand that about him just even through the way he plays drums. And what I mean by that is we have and will continue to make a big fuss about what a technically excellent drummer he is. But one thing about his playing that's underappreciated, and I think this is underappreciated about a lot of drummers, because when we talk about the greatest drummers, we talk about Neil Peart and Bonham and all the big names who just absolutely smashed and did all this crazy stuff, and rightfully so. But a really underappreciated thing in a drummer is simply being able to serve the song in a way that gives it your distinct voice as a drummer, but isn't showy. And the amazing miracle of Taylor Hawkins is that he's able to do these very technical things while he plays and somehow never come across as showy or as though he's trying to sort of steal the spotlight in some way. He is always rigidly devoted to the song and to the art of the song and to the art of his role in the band. And I think that in many ways, another one of the reasons why I think this is a really good choice of a record to celebrate him with is that this is one of the records where he's greatest at doing that, I think. Yeah, we could talk about a record like Wasting Light, where he's just going fucking ham and we'd have a great time. But here is a record, here's a great demonstration of just how selfless Taylor can be as a performer, how much he can do his job, add to the songs and make sure they have that muscle that makes them memorable, that makes them kick, but also like exist within this space in the mix and in these songs that doesn't intrude on anything else that's going on either. It seems like something that shouldn't be possible to do, like be incredible in terms of your performance, but also like not be necessarily any more of a standout than what Dave's doing on the drums and what Nate Mendel, who I always forget was also the bassist in Sunny Day Real Estate, is doing on the bass too. Like, amazing.
The drummer before Hawkins, who I'm not sure actually ever played on any albums, maybe he did, was Sunny Day Real Estate's drummer William Goldsmith.
Oh yeah, shit, that's right. I forget how many the connections there go two people deep, but yeah.
That relationship did not end well between him and Grohl. I don't know the story.
The producer also produced Diary, for the record.
Oh, there we go. I feel like I should have already known that.
Explains why this record sounds like God.
I mean, what better example than on the track that you already mentioned, which is Generator, which is like,
I mean, talk box.
The talk box on the guitar. I was going to bring that up. Like
that sounds so shit. Why don't more bands do this? This is like
it sounds like that's so immediately what you like notice about it. And the cool thing about it too is that the first 20 seconds of that song is it's that talk box guitar is like awesome, but it's also just Taylor like freaking the fuck out. And then like right at the 20-second mark, immediately the song like locks into place, and then a completely different thing starts, and then it starts being this like the vocal layering on Dave's voice is like really surprisingly gentle, but it's really high up in the mix. And like those, like, it's a great example of what you're talking about, Riley, because it's like I wouldn't say that there's a lot on this song that's like overtly instrumentally impressive, but the way everything comes together has that beautiful elemental simplicity that like defines the Foo Fighters to me. Generator, like I would say right now it might be my favorite Foo Fighters song, but it's just everything about the way that it's built is perfect.
I got to bring up the production and mixing on this album because it is so fucking good. Like the mixing is so clear. It is like jaw-dropping because the bass comes across so well, and that's such a hard feat to accomplish for a lot of rock bands, especially rock bands in the 90s. And it sounds, and you can hear it so well. The layering of this whole thing is so well done.
So we should celebrate at this point the mixer here, who has had plenty of celebration. One of the most prolific rock mixers ever, Andy Wallace. And if you don't know his name, you'll remember it because I'm just going to read you through some of his credits. All right. Rain and Blood from Slayer.
All right.
Nevermind from Nirvana. He mixed that record. He mixed Sonic Youth's Dirty. He mixed Screaming Trees, Sweet Oblivion, and Dust. He mixed Rage Against the Machine, self-titled. He mixed Sepultura's Chaos AD. He mixed Jeff Buckley's Grace.
Oh my God.
Like, if you can mix a Jeff Buckley album and a Sepultura album, like,
you're the GOAT is what you are.
Fuck off.
And
I'm seeing one later down the line, and I'll let you do it right.
He mixed System of a Down's Toxicity, and maybe most that one along with this next one are maybe most pertinent to what August is saying about how the heft of the band is so well complemented here. He also mixed Relationship of Command. So that's
the one I saw, and I was like, "Holy fuck!" This.
And The Artist in the Ambulance by Thrice too. So like you have some like proper. You have someone here who has like a very, very refined and professional idea of how to make dynamics work in heavy music. And I think people a lot of the time when they think of Foo Fighters outside of just the singles context, they think of this band in terms of their heft and their intensity. But one of the things I love about them, one of the things you discover about them as you dive into them, and of course one of the things that a record like In Your Honor makes like explicitly clear, is how dynamic this band actually is, how the heft that they're able to really convey is only meaningful because of how tender they can be as well. And that doesn't necessarily mean like tender songs, but just tender moments, like a sense of dynamics, and how a record like this is mixed is so key to that. And I agree. I think this is one of the best sounding Foo Fighters. It might even be the best sounding Foo Fighters record.
You know what? So. Yeah. Like on that point, I got to quickly interject that this is like such a great mixture of harder, heavier tracks and more balladry stuff. I think it's a mixture that Dave has been kind of fighting with for the first two Foo Fighters albums, like how exactly to balance those two types of songs. And here he just strikes the perfect balance, and it's a really well sequenced, well paced album.
Well, I think on this record, you have songs that are examples of at least three distinct things that the Foo Fighters are kind of known for. And one is just like the blistering heaviness of a song like Stacked Actor, for instance. One is the kind of commercial sensibilities that are rendered like very tastefully and beautifully and hookily in a song like Learn to Fly. And the other thing that this record masters is the synthesis of all of this, like the synthesis of the heft, of the softness, of the beauty, of the pure musicianship. And that, of course, is displayed nowhere better, in my opinion, than my favorite Foo Fighters song, which is Aurora, the centerpiece of this record.
For mine.
It's so striking that you almost forget you're listening to the Foo Fighters for a second when it comes on, and just when you're kind of absorbing it. But it is unmistakably
guitar chords at the beginning. It's so fucking pretty, man. Like
it's gorgeous. It's frankly a staggeringly beautiful song, and it is so well positioned as a centerpiece to this record that it takes my breath away. I mean, like it comes right after Generator, which we've already like praise to high heavens. And
what a 1-2 punch.
It's an incredible moment at the center of this record where I think in a lot of ways, I guess you could say this about a song like Learn to Fly or even Blackout to a certain extent, but like for me, this is the moment where Foo Fighters become like a great band and like a truly diversely talented band. It all kind of congeals here. And it's just like a fucking staggering track. And it just goes on and on and on and just keeps getting better and better. And just fuck, man. And Taylor on the song, what can you say? Like, what can you say? He's absolutely outrageous. And again, it's never at the expense of the rest of his bandmates either. It's never in a way that feels like it steals away from everything else that's going on. You could just zero in on the guitar and not be like distracted. If you wanted to listen to the song and just zero in on the guitar, you could do that. If you wanted to listen to the song and just zero in on the drums, you could do that. But man, is he making his fucking presence known here still, all the same. You know, that's the beautiful talent of Taylor Hawkins, is how he can make his presence known without showing off. And yeah, I mean, this was the moment, I think, you know, listening to this over the weekend where it really, you know, and I won't pretend to be someone who's like, you know, got this deep personal connection to the Foo Fighters, but I fell in love with a lot of their music when I was really diving through that discog in February last year. And I can't pretend to have the same connection that Jake or Morgan do, but listening to this song over the weekend, I mean, it was hard. It was tough. It was not easy. But yeah, it's why we're here, you know? It's why we're here. It's why we have to do this. And I'm so glad that I'm so fucking not glad that this is the reason we're doing this now is the reason that it is, but I'm so glad that we are here doing this. I'm so glad that we have an excuse to do this, even if the excuse is the worst, most awful excuse possible. Because every second that I spend as a music fan thinking about Taylor Hawkins' presence and personality and drumming and the Foo Fighters, as a second I feel ecstatically in love with rock music.
It's kind of easy to lose sight of that, you know, like when you're that's why I think this is fundamentally a band that deserves our shout out and our push, and that I was so upset that we couldn't talk about an album that we all liked a little bit more, is that it's like, you know, generally you have, you know, the albums like The Color and the Shape, which are, you know, seen as classics no matter what. But as like a band, as a presence, as people who make music, it just kind of feels like they're a bit lost on the wayside with like our generation specifically, just because they are so distinctly a rock band. And a rock band in the year 2022, like what even is that, you know? Like that's just not something like a rock band right now is Black Midi. A rock band right now is Black Country New Road. So it feels like we're in a different era. So when you kind of get to go back to this, I almost feel like Foo Fighters music, even music from them that I hadn't even like heard before when I first got into them, felt inherently kind of nostalgic, just because it was harkening back to an era where like the world was kind of different, or just the world of music was different. And one thing I want to shout out here, especially on Aurora and Generator for that matter, is that we're talking about how Hawkins is great at making his presence known without overshadowing anybody. But I mean, Dave fucking Grohl on this album, both vocals and guitar, oh my God. I mean, from the second Stacked Actors starts, and that fucking guitar is just, I mean, that sounds like it's the distorted fucking guitar at the end of like Big Game by Everything. It's fucking ridiculous. It's awesome.
Like the thought I had listening to it for this video earlier was just like, Mastodon, you're nothing. You're like,
That's the kind of proficiency that you get out of these people. Like that was what I went when I like listened to Color and the Shape for the first time, and I heard something like Monkey Wrench, and I was like, this is what this band sounds like. Oh my God. And that's kind of the feeling you sort of get consistently here, especially with a song like Aurora, because like Dave is like, to think that Dave was ever a part of a band where he wasn't the front man is genuinely like what? He's got this overwhelming charisma about him that makes him so like lovable to, you know, fans of the band and stuff, but he's also just, he's such a blanketly talented, technically great singer. When he needs to rein it in and do something that's a little bit more intimate or even balladesque, or just Aurora, where, you know, the fucking verses on this song, the way his voice sounds is just indescribable with the way it's layered onto here. Like in tandem with the guitars, there's just such a beautiful synchronicity to the sounds that are happening. And then when he needs to fucking go hard on shit like Stacked Actors, or when he just needs to hit something really high like on Learn to Fly, he will give you that and more. He's like one of the best presences in all of rock music, and he doesn't get his due, I think, just because, you know, I feel like a lot of people still, you know, since at least like Nirvana was like such a culturally important band that like they're always kind of live on in a way that overshadows most bands, that sort of his presence in that band kind of still overshadows his spearheading creative direction of this one, which is like, it just like, it is just something that fundamentally should not go unsaid and underappreciated, because he's just terrific. Like he's the reason this band have endured as long as they have. You know, obviously not to diminish Taylor, it's their chemistry that have like kept them together, and like in interviews and stuff, it's been something that like I talked about this like right after I got the news, and we were talking in the group chat, is that like a month ago I just did nothing one afternoon but listen to interviews with Dave Grohl and with him. And it was just like, just seeing how passionate these guys were. And then they were making music that is like, as they went on, increasingly less, I guess, what is traditionally seen as commercially viable. And they just do it for the love of it. Sure, they're going to pursue commercial endeavors just because I'm sure that they were forced to at some point or another. And that's what they did a lot on their later stuff, but you never feel like it was out of a sense of compromise or a lack of creative direction. You always get that it's just like, no, this is just what they wanted to do at this point. It's kind of the way I view like later Linkin Park, not to a, you know, that bad of a degree, but it's just like, I could never in a million years consider them anywhere near like a sellout or anything. They just wanted to do something different, and that's what they're doing.
So the thing that comes through the most on like the commercial hits of Foo Fighters, and the greatest hits comp is a great illustration of this, it's just how joyful like their biggest, like their commercial music is when they really lean in that direction.
Yes.
Like Learn to Fly to me is a joyful song. Like I feel really fucking happy listening to it. It's also incredibly nostalgic and has this deep-seated childhood association too. And here's an interesting point I want to make, is that I've seen Foo Fighters a number of times called a singles band. Now, I know, here, I think that is not inherently a bad thing to be necessarily. No, sure. I think that Foo Fighters have great albums. I think that this is a great album, and I think Wasting Light is a great album. And they have a number of very good albums that are hot on the trail of those two. But I also think that singles band is a good way of describing Foo Fighters, and I want to try and change that from the pejorative that it's associated with being, and try and twist it into what it tells us about Foo Fighters, which is that they have music that can cross over and communicate and be powerful to so many millions of people. Songs that you get on that greatest hits comp and other songs as well that have really translated, that have left a distinct mark on popular culture and rock music as it is. And then they bring people in, and then you get caught up in Foo Fighters and you discover the deep cuts. You discover the greatness of so much of their other music that doesn't cross over. Every great singles band, I think, you know, regardless of how you're using that term, regardless of whether you mean like a band that has a lot of great songs but no great albums, or you mean a band that has great albums but just like the big hits are the things that really tower over them. I think that
quintessential example.
This is a great example of that, is a band where the hits bring people in, but then the deep cuts and the stuff like on songs on this record, like Live in Skin, for instance, and Aurora, obviously, as well, which is maybe one of the greatest sort of deep cut sort of songs ever. And, you know, Next Year, which I think is super underrated too on this album.
Yep.
And other songs are like, they're the things that will keep you, like songs like Learn to Fly will bring you to the Foo Fighters, and then songs like Aurora and Live in Skin will keep you locked in, will help you to fall in love with this band. And you know, it's why I go back to a record like One by One, which I think is a deeply flawed album, but the first 4 songs on that record are untouchable. And it's like, they can do that and bring you in. And, you know, even though they have like 3 albums I've given a 4 out of 10, I still consider them a great band, because there's still so much to love about them. There's still so much that's lovable about them, and they don't need to be perfect necessarily to have that lovability. But I'm kind of getting off track here, because I think this is a genuinely great album. We haven't even talked about Breakout, which is like such a fucking amazing single.
If we want to talk about Dave Grohl's voice, we talk about fucking the screams on Breakout, which like I lose my fucking mind.
Man,
they're so good.
He's fucking on fire.
Get me in this fucking pit. I'm going crowd killer.
You know what my favorite ancillary detail about this song is that it's written about the plot of the movie Me, Myself, and Irene, because it was written for that movie. That's my favorite detail about any Foo Fighters
of course
song.
Of course it is.
It's in the movie Me, Myself, and Irene, and it was on that movie's soundtrack. And the song is kind of about like having, you know, being like pushed over the edge such that this different part of you comes out. And it's so funny when you think about it in that context. But of course, like, it is a song that stands head and shoulders on its own. It's a great song, completely apart from that. But it's like so funny to like listen to this song.
Man, I need the context of Me, Myself, and Irene to properly appreciate Breakout by the Foo Fighters.
It's truly like a fucking maybe the god tier example of like a fucking like amazing song, like being made and released and kind of associated with like a movie that is like absolutely forgettable and like completely unworthy of it. I want to touch briefly, it's already been mentioned, but I want to talk about Stacked Actors for a second, because this album has this beautiful sense of like full circleness to it, where it's like a lot of this album, maybe not all of it, but a lot of it is kind of about the trappings of fame, and also like the trappings of like being in the limelight and having to kind of deal with and process that. And you have these 2 great tracks that bookend the record that kind of touch on various aspects of that. And Stacked Actors, you know, second all of the amazing shit that's been said about how hard the song goes, but like it's this very kind of biting, you know, critique of, you know, a fake sort of shallow celebrity culture. But I also like the way that you can read this song as like almost a commentary, and this is me putting a bit of a tinfoil hat on here because I don't know that this is what the song's about, but I feel like you can almost read it as well as like a commentary on expectations from maybe the public or from critical circles on what Foo Fighters should be, on the kind of band they should be, on like the Nirvana 2 thing that they kind of tried to escape so much. And like when I hear that chorus of, hey, now can you fake it? Can you make it look like we won, and we cry when they all die blonde? Like, I feel there's some subtext here where Dave is kind of digging at the notion that his band should be Nirvana 2, or that he's trying to be Kurt Cobain, which he isn't if you listen to any of his music. But like, I feel there's a sort of dig there at the legacy of Nirvana and the sort of the way that's impacted the perception of Foo Fighters as the post-Nirvana band, which to their credit, they managed to escape that shadow really, really easily. Or maybe not easily, but they definitely escaped
well as
it.
Anyone could possibly hope to, really.
But I like that little bit of subtext in that song. I like when Dave gets angry in a song, he really feels it. Like you were talking about his versatility as a vocalist, like that is in tandem with his versatility as like a songwriter in terms of the kind of emotions he can capture. Like he can be beautifully tender and heartbreaking, and he can be fucking furious. And I love that feeling coming through. And then it's like this kind of theme like the trappings of fame, I guess, and of like the culture that you have to come and exist within when you become like a huge figure, is mirrored in MIA, the closing song of the record, which is kind of like, you know, a desire to escape that world. Like he says in the song, never mind mannequins, drunk in their hollow town, drinking their spoils down, cheap imitations, the revelation is now, you won't find me, I'm going MIA. Like his desire to escape all of that. It's a beautiful little like moment where, if you want to think about the record as having an arc, like Stacked Actors is like frustration and anger and just like being embroiled in negative emotion about this scene in this world you're existing within. And then by the time you get to MIA at the end, it's like he's found a way out of that. He's found a way to escape that rage. He's found a way to like get off the map, both literally and figuratively.
Next year onward, I think those like almost work as like a thematic suite, honestly, because like next year is about like, you know, the promise of renewal and like getting a clean slate, and you just sort of built it from there. And then you get Ain't It the Life before MIA, which is sort of this like reaffirming kind of like, it's not like a wholly good or wholly bad kind of thing, but you definitely get the sense that it's like, this is why this album feels to me distinctly underrated, and why it deserves to be more of a quintessential Foo Fighters album, is that it's really Dave getting to like showcase his thematic embrace and love of music. And it just kind of gets to cast aside all of that other shit and just be like, this is who I am, this is what I do, and it's what I love. And it's like, you know, only somebody like him would love doing what he does this much enough to make an album like this, about how liberating it is to feel and to make music like this. It's why it feels like the meta album moments on the album don't feel like, we often talk about how that can kind of drag something down, about how a lot of albums that are about being a band just kind of, you know, they wear their welcome out kind of thin, it's quickly. But this immediately, it's like it does nothing but add to the depth and joy of the album.
August, I'd love to hear some more from you at this point, because we haven't heard a heap from you on this album yet. And I know you have like your familiarity with essentially the Foo Fighters' entire 90s era now, I think. So
yeah.
What's your
You're
perception?
the newest fan, I guess.
You've kind of talked about how like we've talked about in terms of how the band have developed and how the music has kind of progressed from the early era. But what's your sense of how this album sits in relation to their previous work, and how you feel about it personally?
I guess my biggest personal takeaway is the first listen I did to this, I remember immediately like messaging all of you like, this feels like the band figuring themselves out and fully evolving was essentially what I was kind of first struck by this album, because I think there's a sense of cohesion here that their previous albums didn't quite have. Not to say those previous albums, you can just lump them in the bin of being like singles albums, something we've already discussed in this episode. The point being, I think this album takes Grohl and the band's ambitions towards album structuring, album producing, and it takes that ambition and levels it up to a point of professionalism and conciseness that I don't think you get in a lot of popular rock, at least not to this level of intent. It maybe loses a little bit of steam as it kind of starts to wrap up, but that dynamic is what sells it. That mix between those heavy songs and the lighter songs, not light songs, but lighter songs. And really just the diversity of the number of techniques tried, like we've talked about the beautiful talk box use on Generator, and how that leads into Aurora, a song that feels from like a completely different band. That's the level of ambition I like to see in this kind of music, and it excites me when I see that, when a band is examining their own formula and saying, we can expand upon ourselves in this way and in this way, but still feel like one cohesive whole. And that's really the biggest takeaway for me in terms of just what I like on a technical level. And I guess on a more personal, visceral, caveman brain level, this is a fun album to listen to. Let's not get our words twisted there. The drum fills, while most of the time subtle, just add that little zest to the song that really elevates them. Like I think it's on Learn to Fly. There's a drum fill before the chorus or something that's just it elevates the song in a really great way. And I love it when bands have little tiny details that can pull a song into something more than what it is on just the surface. I love stuff like that. I'm always a big fan of just this general, like, little touches, and that's what this album has in spades, and I think what sets it as the best album of theirs I've heard from the 90s.
That makes me so fucking happy just hearing that you really enjoyed this the way that you did, just because, I don't know, there's just something about, it's like Riley said, there's just something inherently joyful about the Foo's music that really helps me come back to it. It's just like, I feel like they could maybe be dismissed as a band it's like cheesy or whatever, and I really think that misses the forest for the trees. You really do not feel a rock band having more fun ever than you do with the Foo Fighters. Like, it's just, there's no like lens that's filtered through. It's just immediately like, damn, these guys really love what they're doing. Even on their lesser albums, it's like, it's still like, you're just like, damn, I bet these guys are having a blast playing live. And that goes to something I think that we definitely shouldn't leave unmentioned, is that Morgan has seen the Foo Fighters live. And I believe you've, at least to me, a couple times cited that as the best concert you've ever been to.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, Foo Fighters are the last rock band, really. And Dave Grohl is the last rock star. And it's because Dave Grohl is not just the last rock star, but that he is pretty much the best rock star. People who achieve that sort of front man charisma, popularity, without ever fucking it up, and also being so multi-talented, like in every sense. He's just like, if you look up the definition of rock star, he is the platonic ideal. He's perfected the idea of it. And I think ultimately why, if I can only pick one Foo Fighters record, I would probably pick There's Nothing Left to Lose over Wasting Light, which some days I like more. The reason I will reach for this one pretty much every time is that it so perfectly conveys what this band does so well, and what people don't always appreciate about them so well. I think it's their most complete package alongside Wasting Light, and so perfectly conveys like how fun they are to listen to. Like, even Medicine at Midnight, which we did not review favorably, is a very fun record, even if it's fun sometimes in the ways where you're like, I don't know about this one, Chief, but at least you followed your passion.
I don't love Cloud Spotter, but I love that you made it.
Yeah.
Right on.
That's, yeah.
Absolutely.
Scream, Guillotine Queen.
I'm shocked you remembered that.
Yeah, I didn't even remember Cloud Spotter.
I'm impressed with myself. I know more lyrics to Cloud Spotter than I care to admit.
I don't know what to do with that information.
In a fucking Kroger the other day. I mean, that's all the evidence you need for Morgan's assertion that they're the last rock band, is that I fucking heard a single from Medicine at Midnight in the grocery store the other day. It's like, can any other rock band do that right now? That's kind of
not good ones.
Don't really think
not
so.
Good bands.
No.
And that's all I'm gonna say on that.
When we started this podcast, I think maybe one of the last bands I would ever guess that we would all communally pretty heavily bond over would be Foo Fighters. That's just like, I just wouldn't have.
And it definitively proves empirically, we have empirical evidence that if you don't like Foo Fighters or if you don't like Dave Grohl, you are a fucking friendless loser. I don't make the rules.
Favorite tracks and ratings for There's Nothing Left to Lose, which I have to stop myself from calling There's Nothing Left to Love because of this podcast. Anyway, I'll go first this time. And my three favorite tracks on this record are going to be Aurora, obviously, Learn to Fly, which I think is as good as it is played on the radio, which is to say fucking a lot.
Yes.
And my third favorite is going to be Live in Skin. Least favorite, if I had to pick one, would probably be Gimme Stitches. And I wavered on this, but I'm actually going to give it the wee bump, and I'm going to give this album an 8 out of 10. I fucking love this thing.
My favorite tracks on this album are Aurora. That's my second favorite Foo Fighters song in general. I will follow it with Generator and Live in Skin. No real least favorites. 10.
Aurora Borealis at this time of year, at this time of day, in this part of the country, localized entirely within your kitchen.
Actually,
yes.
Something for the longest time I thought the name of Generator was Refrigerator because it's followed by the song Aurora, like the Pokemon Aurorus, who has the ability Refrigerator.
I can back up everything Hawkins just said as being verifiably true.
So anyway, three favorite tracks are Generator, Aurora, and Live in Skin. And I think least favorite will, I don't know. Tough one. Probably Headwires. Not awful, but it's like the least of the best. Gets a 7.5 from me. Pretty good album.
I'm just gonna do this just for the sake of a beautiful little moment of unity, where the 3-track run of Generator, Aurora, and Live in Skin is just fucking unmatched. Those are 3 perfect songs, and I am just not going to pick another one because fuck you, you can't make me. So yes, those are my 3 favorite tracks. My least, I fucking like. Look, nothing on here I've got below a 4.0 on Rate Your Music, so yeah, get fucked. I have this is a strong 8.5 out of 10. I'm not sure what my favorite Foo Fighters album is right now, but it could very well end up being this one. Who knows? They made a lot of good fucking music, man.
Amen. That gives us an average rating of 8.5 for Foo Fighters. There is nothing left to lose. Let us know at home what this album means to you. Let us know what the Foo Fighters mean to you. And of course, let us know what Taylor Hawkins means to you. We want to hear your takes. We want to hear your stories. We want to hear your opinions in the comments below. If you're on YouTube, that is. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple, there should be a link to the YouTube page in the description of this podcast. Go and check it out and leave us a comment there if you want to. If you do enjoy the podcast, if you've enjoyed this episode, then we would love if you would like the video, and if you're on a podcast streaming service, give us a 5-star rate and review, only if you liked it, of course. And if you want to support the channel even further and you aren't already a subscriber, then hit the subscribe button too. Make sure you hit the bell so you get notified when we have new videos. And if you really want to make our day, you can also hit the join button on our YouTube page. And for just $1 a month, you can become a supporter of the channel, a member of the Jams and Tea family, and get yourself entitled to such perks as having your name featured in the title crawl of every video on this channel, getting priority comment response. And if you want to give us a musical recommendation, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. And with that, I'm left only to August to send us home.
All right. As always, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Allstate, you're in good hands.